Hi everybody, Katje here, and tonight I'm wearing a goth-inspired outfit because I'm in kind of a witchy mood again, and I would like to discuss another witchy theme. So the topic of tonight's video is, in addition to the clothes, is a very famous, and some would say infamous, crime that occurred in 1993 called the Robin Hood Hills murders. Many of you may be familiar with this. It was gained some notoriety, and you may be familiar with some of the films and documentaries that were made about it. So what I want to do tonight is basically describe what happened and then share some reflections about the outcome. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the crimes. If you're interested, you can go on the internet and read about them. But what happened basically is that in the summer of 1993 in West Memphis, Arkansas, three young boys, were found murdered in the woods near a subdivision named Robin Hood Hills. And suspicion very quickly settled on three teenagers living in the area who were sort of on the margin of society. They dabbled in the occult and were kind of outcasts, or at least perceived that way. So very quickly, they were charged with the murders. There were two separate trials. There were three defendants. One was named Jesse Miss Kelly. Another one was named Damien Eccles, and the third was named Jason Baldwin. Miss Kelly was tried separately. Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin were tried together. And in both trials, the defendants were all found guilty of capital murder, and I believe at least Eccles was sentenced to death and the other two to life in prison. So a lot of doubt was cast on these verdicts because it seemed like there was a rush to judgment. So what I want to do tonight is basically share some of my reflections about this case, which has fascinated me over the years. It really is a very gruesome case. It's very horrible what happened to these children, but a lot of issues come up in it that are very interesting. So I just want to share some of my reflections about that. Now, what I want to do, start out by saying, is that I agree that from a legal standpoint, from a purely legal standpoint, I agree that there was reasonable doubt in both trials. Jesse Miss Kelly was a person who was he was mentally handicapped. He had learning disabilities and a relatively low IQ. He was interviewed by the police for something like 10 or 11 hours, and a lot of the interview was not recorded. He did confess, though, to the murders, and he implicated both Eccles and Baldwin. So there were questions about his, certainly questions about his interview with the police, because a lot of it was not taped, and so we don't know everything that transpired during it. In the case of all three defendants, there was no hard and fast physical evidence that linked any of the defendants with the crimes or with the victims. And there was also no eyewitness testimony that linked any of the defendants with the victims or with the crime. So I agree that from a purely legal standpoint, there was reasonable doubt in these cases, and so I would have to agree that there was a rush to judgment on the part of the juries who convicted these three young men of those crimes. Nevertheless, I think that when we look at cases like this, especially a case like this where three innocent children have been murdered, we want to know what the truth is. And the legal system is not the sole practice or the sole lens, shall we say, through which we should try to discover the truth. At some point in the memory of those children, and also just for curiosity's sake, I think we want to step back and try to make a prudent judgment about what the truth is, taking all of the factors into consideration, some of which I'm going to mention in my comments tonight. So when I do this, having followed this case now since 1993, And what happened basically is that the defendants were in jail until 2011, when there was a kind of a legal legerdemain, or very tricky legal resolution of this called an Alford plea, which allowed them to plead guilty to the crimes, but the agreement was that the state would not retry them and that would actually release them because the state recognized that there was a need for a new trial. So the end result of this was that the 3 defendants are now free. Now, when I step back and look at this case in its entire context, I have to say that I think that the 3 defendants are guilty of these crimes, and I'm going to explain why I think that. There are a couple of reasons several reasons that lead me to believe that. One is that in the case of Jesse Misskelley, who confessed to the crimes and who also implicated the fellow defendants, it's true that there were a lot of problems with the way that confession was taken. Nevertheless, he did confess to these crimes repeatedly during the interview, and only later did he recant his confession, claiming that, well, I was tired, and I basically told the police what they wanted to hear, and I was afraid of them. So I don't really find this this subsequent explanation from him convincing, because I think it's very unlikely that somebody, simply because somebody is tired and maybe a little intimidated by the police, but it's basically because he's tired, is going to confess to murdering 3 innocent children. Even if he has a relatively low IQ or learning disabilities or mental challenges, I find that far-fetched. And I believe that that, together with the fact that in his confession he does provide considerable details that match the layout of the crime scene, I believe that confession was basically accurate. So that's one reason that leads me to believe the way I do about this case. A second reason I have is, and there are basically 4, so the second reason I have is that when Damien Echols was on the stand in his trial, those of you who may have seen, especially the first documentary about the Robin Hood Hills murders, will notice that his demeanor does not really match that of an innocent man who is on trial for his life. He instead comes across as someone who is soaking up media attention. He's combing his hair, he's primping his hair. There are also inconsistencies in his testimony. He claimed never to have read anything by Aleister Crowley or dabbled in occult reading at all, but it turns out that in fact he had. So that, but especially his demeanor on the witness stand and in the course of the trial, did not come across, to me at least, as that of someone who is innocent and fearing for his life and doing everything that he can to save himself from a guilty plea. Rather, it comes across as somebody who's gaining notoriety, and even at the end of the first documentary, he says that, well, he almost hopes that maybe at some point he will become a legendary figure that people many years after the fact will continue to talk about, almost like the boogeyman. I think he uses that comparison. Well, to me, that's psychologically very troubling, because again, it doesn't sound like the behavior or the testimony or the words of an innocent person. So that's the second reason. The third reason that I believe the 3 defendants are guilty is that, and this is a very powerful scene, a kind of eerie scene towards the end of the first documentary, in the second trial, where Jason Baldwin and Damien Echols and their attorneys are waiting for the verdict to come down. Baldwin is alone in a room with his attorney, and at one point they have a conversation about Damien Echols, and the attorney says, well, do you think that he would be could possibly be capable of doing something like this, and can you see how his demeanor on the stand really didn't help him? And so it was good that you didn't do that. But do you think he might have would it surprise you that he might have done something like this? Do you think he might be capable of doing something like this? there were questions that Baldwin's attorney asked him that had that gist. And Jason Baldwin doesn't really answer. He's very cagey, and I had the very strong sense that he was holding something back, that he had warned that he could say, but wasn't going to because the camera was running. When you look at that scene, I think if you examine it very carefully, you will probably come away with the same sense that I did, which is that, well, here's a young person who has a lot more to say about his co-defendant, and in fact does believe or does seem to take very seriously the possibility that, well, this is someone capable of committing these kinds of crimes, but doesn't share it. I felt when I saw that if I had about 30 minutes in the room with Jason Baldwin, and if I had pressed him, I didn't want to beat him up or hurt him or anything, but if I were to press him, I think that I might have been able to get him to open up about that. But even if I hadn't, I really did feel that he was holding something back. So the final reason that leads me to believe that the three defendants are guilty is that no plausible alternative account of these murders, at least to my knowledge, has ever been set forth. At different times and in some of the different documentaries, suspicion has been turned on individual adult men. I think there was a second film, and the father of one of the victims, John Mark Byers, it was suggested that he might have actually committed these crimes. Then there was another man, he was also the father of one of the victims, or at least he was the stepfather, I think. His name was Terry Hobbs, and so another film and other reporters suggested that he might have actually been the perpetrator, that actually some of his DNA was found on one of the shoestrings that was used to tie up one of the victims before they were savagely butchered and murdered. There might be other explanations about how a stepfather's DNA could get on his stepson's shoelaces. He might have tied the child's shoes and some skin cells might have rubbed off. So I didn't feel like that was very conclusive, but more to the point, I don't think that a single adult male perpetrator really fits with the logistics of the crime, because let's consider what we're dealing with there. We have three prepubescent boys who were all murdered at the same place, and probably when they were detained or captured by the murderer or the murderers, they were very frightened, they were very excited, and so I have a very hard time picturing in my mind how a single adult could subdue three prepubescent children and then in series murder them. I don't understand how that would work unless he had somehow, or the murderer had somehow administered, for example, drugs or barbiturates or some kind of a sedative to the victims. There's no indication from the forensics or the pharmacological report or the coroner's report, the autopsy on the three victims, that any one of them had sedatives or any kind of drugs in their systems at the time that they were murdered. So it would be very difficult for me to envision two adult men subduing three prepubescent children in this way, and it's almost impossible for me to imagine one adult male doing that. What I can very easily picture is three adults or three adolescents, one for each victim, subduing his respective victim, and then the children were killed in the way that they were. So that picture of the crime, that scenario, that fits, those logistics fit with the three defendants. And there's no other theory, to my knowledge, of multiple defendants that has ever been put forward by any lawyers or any reporters or anybody else. Of course, it's always possible that happened, but we don't have any reason to think it. So what is the end result of all this? It seems to me, and again, I may be wrong, and if I'm wrong, I hope that I will be forgiven. I certainly don't want to jump to conclusions and accuse somebody who's innocent of committing crimes that they didn't commit. But if I'm right, it really is my hope that at some point those three perpetrators, the defendants, whom I think are guilty, that they will at some point seek some kind of forgiveness or admit what they've done and try to, will find some kind of forgiveness, because I think that when we step back and look at this case from a more practical standpoint, not just a narrow legal standpoint, but from this broader and more practical perspective, I think that there are very good reasons to suspect that the three defendants who, as a matter of fact, were unjustly convicted in the legal sense, are, as a matter of fact, guilty of those crimes. But again, if I'm wrong about that, I would apologize, because I don't want to be unfair, but I also have to be honest and say, well, that's what I think. So that's all I wanted to say about that tonight. I just wanted to model my goth look for you just a little bit more. Tonight I'm wearing a Lauren Gellner eyeshadow in gray tones, and I also am wearing some gray lipstick. I think it's either Maybelline or I think it's Maybelline. And so I wanted to use this look because I thought it fits. I think it fits very well with the theme of my remarks tonight. But anyway, this is Katje Eckhart, and thank you for joining me again. I wish everybody a peaceful and a restful good night. Until next time, bye-bye.